Hey friend, tonight we wander into the shadowed corners of Europe's palaces, where daughters were born not for themselves, but for the crown. Their lives, wrapped in silk and ceremony, carried the weight of bloodlines so carefully guarded, so dangerously interwoven. Beneath the glow of candlelight and the watchful eyes of ancestors staring down from painted frames, they lived as pawns on a royal chessboard. Some were married off to cousins they barely knew. Others gave birth to fragile children who bore the marks of centuries of narrowed lineage. Behind the marble halls and jeweled crowns lies a quiet sadness, a story of women traded for alliances, of families bound too tightly, of beauty mingled with sorrow. So, settle in, let the past unfold slowly, and listen as history whispers from the quiet chambers of Europe's royal daughters.
Born to the crown. In the quiet, candlelit chambers of a European palace, the birth of a child is never a private affair. It is a state event, a moment of profound political significance. And when that child is a daughter, her first breath is not just a gasp for air, but an inhalation of a destiny that has been decided for her long before she was even conceived. She is not seen as a person, not yet. She is seen as an asset, a living, breathing, and incredibly valuable chess piece on the great, sprawling, and often ruthless dynastic board of Europe. Imagine a princess born into the house of Habsburg or Bourbon or Stuart. She does not come into the world in a quiet, private room. The chamber is filled with silent, watchful figures, ministers of state, ambassadors from foreign courts, high-ranking ladies of the household. They are there to witness the birth, to verify its legitimacy, to ensure that the infant does not switch, that the line of succession is secure. Her birth is a matter of public record from its very first moment.
She is swaddled not just in fine linen and silk, but in a web of expectations. While a royal son is seen as the future of the dynasty, a direct continuation of the line, a royal daughter is seen as its future connection. She is a vessel of precious royal blood, and her primary, and often her sole, purpose is to be used to forge an alliance, to seal a treaty, to mend a rivalry, to expand the family's influence. Her marriage is not a matter of personal choice or affection. It is a matter of high-stakes international diplomacy. Her education is tailored to this singular purpose. She is not taught the arts of statecraft or of war like her brothers. She is taught the arts of the court. She learns to speak multiple languages: French, the language of diplomacy; Spanish, the language of a great empire; perhaps Italian, the language of culture. She learns to play a musical instrument, like the lute or the harpsichord, to a high standard. She learns to dance the slow, stately, and complex dances of the court, the pavane and the galliard. She learns the intricate and unforgiving rules of courtly etiquette. She learns how to dress, how to walk, how to speak, how to be a perfect, polished, and pleasing embodiment of royal grace.
But the most important lesson she learns is the lesson of obedience. From her earliest childhood, she is taught that her own desires, her own will, her own heart are of no consequence. Her duty is to her family, to her dynasty, to the political needs of her father's kingdom. She is a lamb, bred and raised for a specific, sacrificial purpose. Her life is lived in a gilded cage. She is surrounded by immense wealth and luxury, by beautiful gowns, by precious jewels, by armies of servants. But she has no freedom. She is never truly alone. She is always attended by her ladies-in-waiting, who are her companions, but also her chaperones, her guardians, and her spies, reporting on her every word and action.
Her correspondence is read, her movements are controlled. Her life is a constant public performance of the role she was born to play. And all the while, the great game of her future is being played out in the secret councils of state. Ambassadors and ministers are engaged in a long, slow, and complex negotiation. Her portrait, painted by a court artist, is sent to a foreign court to be scrutinized by a prince she has never met. She is discussed in terms of her dowry, of the territories her marriage will bring, of the strategic advantage her alliance will confer. She is a name in a treaty, a clause in a contract. When the deal is finally struck, she is told of her fate. She will be sent to a foreign land, to a court whose customs she does not know, to marry a man she has seen only in a stiff, formal portrait. She may be a child of 10 or 12 or 14. Her childhood is over. Her life as a living chess piece is about to begin. She is a daughter of the crown, and her destiny is to be traded like a precious jewel for the greater glory of her house.
Bloodlines and alliances. In the quiet, drafty corridors of the royal palaces, there is an obsession that underlies every decision, every marriage, every political maneuver. It is the obsession with blood. The blood of a royal family is not seen as a simple biological fluid. It is a mystical, almost sacred substance, a vessel of legitimacy, of power, and of divine right. To be born with royal blood is to be fundamentally different from and superior to the mass of ordinary humanity. And the primary duty of every dynasty is to preserve the purity and the potency of this precious, magical bloodline. This obsession is rooted in a deep-seated belief in the divine right of kings. The monarch is not just a political leader, he is God's chosen representative on earth. His authority is passed down through his blood, a sacred inheritance from one generation to the next. To dilute this blood, to mix it with the blood of a commoner, or even of a lesser noble, is to weaken the divine mandate, to risk the stability of the entire kingdom. The bloodline is the fragile, invisible thread that connects the present king to the sacred past, and it must be protected at all costs. The result of this obsession is a deeply insular and claustrophobic world of royal marriage. The pool of acceptable marriage partners for a prince or a princess is incredibly small. A Catholic monarch must marry a Catholic. A king must marry the daughter of another king, or at the very least, of a sovereign duke. The great royal houses of Europe, the Habsburgs, the Bourbons, the Stuarts, the Romanovs, begin to see themselves as a single, transnational, and divinely ordained family. They are the members of an exclusive club, and the only suitable marriage partners for their children are the other members of that same club. And so, the great, intricate, and ultimately disastrous web of royal intermarriage begins to be woven. The marriage of a royal daughter is the primary tool of foreign policy. A princess of Spain is married to a prince of France to seal a peace treaty between the two great rivals. A princess of Austria is married to a king of Portugal to create a strategic alliance against a common enemy. The map of Europe is a complex and ever-shifting cat's cradle of these dynastic marriages. The daughters of these great houses are the living threads that are used to weave this tapestry of alliances. The problem is that the pool of suitable, high-ranking, and religiously correct partners is so small that the same families are forced to intermarry again and again, generation after generation. The result is a royal family tree that begins to look less like a branching tree and more like a tangled, inward-growing vine. First cousins marry first cousins. Uncles marry their nieces. The lines of descent become hopelessly convoluted. A single individual might be descended from the same ancestor through multiple different lines, their bloodline not so much a line,
as a closed, repeating loop. This is not seen as a biological problem. The science of genetics does not yet exist. On the contrary, this intermarriage is often seen as a good thing. It is a way of concentrating the precious royal blood, of making it even purer, even more potent. To marry a close relative is to double down on the sacred inheritance of the dynasty. It is a way of ensuring that no foreign or lesser blood contaminates the sacred vessel. But the hidden dangers are immense. The very thing that is meant to strengthen the dynasty, the purity of the bloodline, is in fact its greatest weakness. The royal families of Europe are, unknowingly, conducting a long, slow, and catastrophic experiment in human inbreeding. And the results of this experiment will be written in the frail bodies, the troubled minds, and the tragic fates of their own children.
The Habsburg Puzzle. Of all the great royal houses of Europe, none pursued the strategy of dynastic intermarriage with more relentless and ultimately self-destructive determination than the House of Habsburg. For over 300 years, this powerful and ambitious family dominated the continent, ruling over a vast and sprawling empire that included Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, and huge swathes of the New World. Their motto was Belligerant Ali, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. And marry they did, weaving a complex, glittering, and ultimately poisonous web of consanguineous unions that would leave their dynasty scarred by generations of physical and mental decline. The Habsburg puzzle began in earnest in the 15th century. Through a series of brilliant and strategically astute marriages, they transformed themselves from a minor ducal house into the preeminent power in Europe. But having reached the top, their primary obsession became one of preservation. They had a deep and abiding sense of their own sacred, God-given destiny, and they believed that the best way to protect their vast inheritance was to keep it, quite literally, all in the family.
The dynasty split into two main branches, the Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs. And for the next 2 centuries, these two branches would engage in a continuous and systematic exchange of brides and grooms. Spanish infantas would be sent to Vienna to marry their Austrian cousins. Austrian archduchesses would be sent to Madrid to marry their Spanish cousins. The family tree becomes a dizzying and almost incomprehensible labyrinth of repeated connections. Uncles married nieces with an alarming frequency. First cousins married first cousins. The result was a dramatic and rapid increase in the coefficient of inbreeding, a genetic measure of how closely related two individuals are. The most famous and most visible physical trait to emerge from this genetic crucible was the Habsburg jaw. This was a specific and pronounced facial deformity, a severe underbite known as mandibular prognathism, where the lower jaw grows so much longer than the upper jaw that the lower teeth jut out far beyond the upper teeth. This made it difficult to chew, and in its most extreme forms, even difficult to speak. It was often accompanied by a long, narrow face and a large, drooping lower lip. This distinctive and unattractive facial structure became the unmistakable trademark of the family, a visible physical manifestation of their shared and increasingly concentrated genetic heritage.
But the problems were more than just cosmetic. The intensive inbreeding led to a host of other health issues. Infant and child mortality rates within the family were shockingly high, even by the standards of the time. Many of the royal daughters would suffer from multiple miscarriages and stillbirths. The children who did survive were often frail, sickly, and prone to a variety of ailments. And there were whispers of other, less visible problems. The family seemed to be plagued by a strain of melancholy, of deep, debilitating depression. There were stories of erratic behavior, of fits of rage, of a profound and often incapacitating mental fragility.
The case of Juana the Mad, an early Spanish Habsburg queen consumed by a pathological grief, was a dark and cautionary tale that would echo down through the generations. The Habsburgs were caught in a trap of their own making. Their political strategy, which had been so brilliantly successful in building their empire, was now destroying the very biological foundation upon which that empire rested. Each new cousin marriage was a roll of the genetic dice, a gamble that was becoming more and more likely to result in a child who was physically deformed, mentally unstable, or simply too frail to survive. The great Habsburg puzzle, the intricate game of dynastic chess that they had played so masterfully, was slowly and inexorably leading them to a genetic checkmate.
The role of queens and princesses. The roles played by men and women were starkly and rigidly defined. The king was the actor, the protagonist, the one who wielded the power, who waged the wars, who made the laws. His wife, the queen, and his daughters, the princesses, were for the most part not actors in their own right. They were the precious human props in the great drama of dynastic politics. Women who were traded like treasures, with little or no say in their own fate. Their lives a long and often lonely sacrifice for the good of the house. The primary role of a queen consort was a biological one. Her most important and most sacred duty was to produce a male heir. Her entire life, from the moment of her marriage, was a cycle of pregnancy, of childbirth, of the nursery. Her success or failure as a queen was judged, first and foremost, by her ability to provide a healthy son to continue the dynasty. A queen who produced only daughters, or who was barren, was seen as a failure, a disappointment, a woman who had failed in her fundamental purpose. She might be treated with coldness and contempt by her husband and by the court. She might, as in the famous case of Catherine of Aragon, be cast aside and replaced by a younger, hopefully more fertile wife.
The queen was also expected to be a model of piety, of charity, and of wifely submission. She was the decorative and moral centerpiece of the court. She was expected to be a patron of the arts, to dress in a manner that displayed the wealth and the prestige of the kingdom, to preside over the complex social life of the court with grace and with dignity. But she was rarely expected, or allowed, to wield any real political power of her own. Her influence was indirect, exercised through her husband or her son. She was a soft power player, a whisperer in the ear of the king. A queen who was seen as too ambitious, too politically astute, was often viewed with deep suspicion, as a dangerous and unnatural meddler in the world of men. For a princess, a royal daughter, the role was even more passive. She was a pawn in the great game of dynastic marriage. From the moment of her birth, her value was calculated in terms of the political alliance her marriage could create. She was an object to be exchanged, a piece of living currency used to purchase a treaty, to secure a border, to end a war. Her life was a long and carefully managed preparation for this single, transactional event. She was educated to be the perfect, polished, and obedient bride. Her own feelings, her own desires, were considered to be completely irrelevant. The concept of marrying for love was a fantasy, a theme for the songs of the troubadours, not a reality for a daughter of a king.
When the time came, she would be sent, often at a very young age, to a foreign land, to a court she did not know, to marry a man she had never met. She would have to learn a new language, new customs, a new and often hostile courtly environment. She was often lonely, isolated, and homesick, a stranger in a strange land.
Her primary duty was the same as her mother's, to produce a male heir for her new dynasty, to bind the two houses together with the flesh and blood of a child. There were, of course, exceptions. There were the great ruling queens, like Elizabeth I of England or Isabella of Castile, women who inherited the throne in their own right and who ruled with an authority and a skill that was equal to any man's. But these women were the rare and brilliant exceptions to the rule. For the vast majority of royal women, life was a gilded cage, a life of immense privilege, but of profound powerlessness, a life of silent, dutiful, and often heartbreaking sacrifice. The price of a pure bloodline. The great royal houses of Europe were engaged in a relentless, centuries-long pursuit of a dangerous illusion, the illusion of a pure bloodline. They believed that by marrying their children to their own close relatives, they were concentrating the sacred, mystical qualities of their royal blood, making their dynasty stronger, more legitimate, more divine. But in reality, they were playing a high-stakes game of genetic roulette, and the price of their obsession was paid in the quiet, heartbreaking tragedies of the royal nursery and the whispered, fearful rumors of a family curse. The most immediate and most devastating price was paid in the currency of infant and child mortality. The children born of these consanguineous unions were often tragically frail. The rate of miscarriages and stillbirths in the great royal families, particularly among the Spanish Habsburgs, was shockingly high, far exceeding the already high rates of the general population. A queen might endure a dozen pregnancies, but see only 2 or 3 of her children survive to adulthood. The royal nursery, which should have been a place of life and of hope, was often a place of profound and recurring grief. The children who did survive were frequently plagued by a host of health problems. The intensive inbreeding did not just concentrate the desirable royal traits, it also concentrated the rare and harmful recessive genes that are present in any family's genetic heritage. In a normal outbred population, these harmful genes are usually masked by a healthy dominant gene from the other parent. But in an inbred population, there is a much higher chance that a child will inherit 2 copies of the same harmful recessive gene, one from each of their closely related parents, allowing the genetic disorder to be expressed. The royal families became unwitting collectors of these rare genetic diseases. The children were often small, weak, and sickly, with compromised immune systems that left them vulnerable to the common illnesses of the age. They suffered from a variety of poorly understood and often undiagnosed genetic syndromes. The whispers of a family curse began to circulate in the superstitious atmosphere of the court. The constant succession of stillbirths, the early deaths of the royal princes and princesses, the physical deformities like the Habsburg jaw, these were seen by many as signs of divine displeasure, a punishment from God for the sins of the dynasty. The priests would preach of the biblical prohibitions against incest, and the common people would mutter that the royal blood was not pure, but tainted, cursed. For the royal daughters, who were the vessels of this fragile and problematic bloodline, the burden was immense. Their own health was often delicate, and the pressure on them to produce a healthy male heir was almost unbearable. Each pregnancy was a source of intense anxiety for the entire kingdom. The queen would be subjected to a barrage of prayers, of special diets, of strange and often disgusting folk remedies, all in the hope of ensuring a successful birth. And when a pregnancy ended, as it so often did, in the tragedy of a stillborn child or the birth of a sickly infant who would not survive the year, the grief of the mother was compounded by a sense of public failure, of having failed in her most sacred and essential duty. The price of the pure bloodline was a terrible and ironic one.
The very strategy that was designed to secure the future of the dynasty was in fact systematically destroying it from within. The great royal houses, in their arrogant pursuit of a mystical purity, were slowly but surely breeding themselves into fragility, into sickness, and ultimately into extinction. The whispers of a curse were not far from the truth, but the curse was not a supernatural one. It was a curse that was written in their own, closely guarded, and fatally compromised blood.
Juana of Castile, La Loca. In the sad, long, and often tragic gallery of Europe's royal daughters, there is one figure whose story has become a dark and enduring legend. She is Juana of Castile, the daughter of the great Catholic monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. She is known to history as Juana La Loca, Juana the Mad. Her story is a heartbreaking tale of passionate love, of profound grief, and of a mental fragility that may have been the first terrible warning sign of the genetic storm that was gathering in the heart of her family, the nascent house of Habsburg. Juana was not born to be a queen. She had an older brother and an older sister, and she was expected to play the traditional role of a royal princess, a pawn in the great game of dynastic marriage. She was a highly intelligent and accomplished young woman, but she was also known to have a passionate, intense, and somewhat melancholy temperament. In 1496, at the age of 16, she was sent to Flanders to marry Philip the Handsome, the Duke of Burgundy, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor. The marriage was a purely political one, designed to forge a powerful alliance against France. But for Juana, it was a fateful and all-consuming love match. From the moment she saw her handsome, charming, and notoriously unfaithful husband, she fell deeply and obsessively in love with him. Her love was a fire, a passionate and possessive devotion that would become the central and ultimately destructive force of her life.
Then, a series of unexpected deaths in her family, the death of her brother, her older sister, and her young nephew, left Juana as the heir to the vast and wealthy kingdom of Castile. She was suddenly no longer just a Duchess of Burgundy. She was the future queen of one of the most powerful nations in Europe. Her new status, combined with her husband's constant and flagrant infidelities, began to take a terrible toll on her already fragile emotional state. She was consumed by a pathological jealousy. There were public scenes, fits of rage, periods of deep withdrawn depression. Her behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. The whispers at court began. Was the young princess unstable? Was she mad? The great tragedy of her life occurred in 1506. Her husband, Philip, still a young and vigorous man, died suddenly of a fever. For Juana, who had built her entire emotional world around him, the loss was an unbearable, soul-shattering blow. Her grief was not the quiet, dignified sorrow expected of a queen. It was a wild, extravagant, and terrifying obsession.
She refused to be separated from his body. She had his corpse embalmed, and she kept it with her, traveling with the funeral cortege across the Castilian countryside for months. At night, she would have the coffin opened, and she would sit for hours, weeping, caressing the cold face of her dead husband, talking to him as if he were still alive. Her behavior was so bizarre, so shocking, so far outside the bounds of normal grieving, that it convinced her father, Ferdinand, and her own court that she was indeed mad, that she was unfit to rule. She was confined to a fortress palace in the small, remote town of Tordesillas, and there she would remain, a prisoner, for the next 46 years of her life. She was the rightful Queen of Castile, but her own son, the future Emperor Charles V, would rule in her name, keeping his own mother under lock and key to secure his own power. The story of Juana la Loca is a complex and tragic one. Was she truly mad in a clinical sense, or was she a passionate and intelligent woman driven to extreme behavior by a profound grief and by the ruthless political machinations of the men around her husband, her father, and her son, who all sought to control her and her inheritance? The truth is likely a combination of both. But her story is also a chilling foreshadowing of the fate of her dynasty. She was one of the first products of the great Habsburg marriage strategy, and her story, with its themes of intense, obsessive passions, of deep melancholy, and of a fragile and breaking mind, would be a dark and recurring echo in the lives of her descendants for the next 200 years. She was the first tragic face of a family that was, in its relentless pursuit of power, beginning to sow the seeds of its own slow and agonizing decay.
Maria Theresa and her many children. In the 18th century, in the grand Baroque palaces of Vienna, there ruled a woman of immense power, of formidable intelligence, and of an almost supernatural fertility. She was Maria Theresa, the Archduchess of Austria, the Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, and the formidable matriarch of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine. In a world where the production of heirs was the primary duty of a monarch, Maria Theresa was an unparalleled success. She endured 16 pregnancies and gave birth to 16 children, 11 of whom were daughters. And in her hands, these daughters became the most valuable and the most powerful diplomatic weapon in Europe. Maria Theresa was a pragmatist. She had inherited her throne through a bitter and difficult war, the War of the Austrian Succession, and she knew that the survival and the prosperity of her vast and multi-ethnic empire depended on a delicate and ever-shifting web of alliances. She was the grand master of the old Habsburg strategy. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. Her womb was the factory that produced the raw material for her foreign policy, and her daughters were the beautifully packaged products to be shipped to the courts of Europe.
She was a loving but deeply demanding and controlling mother. Her letters to her children are a fascinating mixture of genuine maternal affection and cold, hard political calculation. She was obsessed with their health, with their education, with their moral and spiritual well-being. But she was also obsessed with their role in her grand dynastic plan. Each daughter was a project, a piece to be carefully and strategically placed on the great chessboard of Europe. Her eldest and favorite daughter, Maria Anna, was intelligent but suffered from poor health and a spinal deformity, making her unmarriageable. She was kept at court, a quiet and often overlooked figure. But for her other, healthier daughters, a grand dynastic fate was planned from the cradle. Maria Carolina, her mother's other favorite, was the one exception to the rule of political marriage. She was allowed to marry for love, to a prince who was her social inferior, a decision that caused a great deal of resentment among her less fortunate sisters. Maria Amalia was married to the Duke of Parma, a marriage designed to strengthen Austrian influence in Italy. It was a deeply unhappy match, and Amalia, a proud and willful woman, would clash for years with her overbearing mother. But the most famous and the most tragic of all of Maria Theresa's marital schemes involved her youngest daughters. Maria Carolina was married to the brutish and boorish King Ferdinand IV of Naples. She was a strong and intelligent woman, and she would come to dominate her weak husband and the Neapolitan court, becoming a powerful and often ruthless political player in her own right, a true daughter of her mother.
And then there was Maria Antonia, a pretty, charming, and somewhat frivolous young archduchess. To seal the most important and the most difficult alliance of all, the new and fragile alliance with Austria's traditional enemy, France, she was betrothed to the heir to the French throne, the Dauphin Louis. She was sent to France, her name was changed to the more French-sounding Marie Antoinette, and she was plunged into the glittering, decadent, and treacherous world of the court of Versailles. Her marriage was a supreme act of statecraft, the final and most brilliant move in Maria Theresa's long, dynastic game. It was a move that was designed to bring peace and stability to Europe. It was a move that would, through a series of tragic and unforeseen events, lead her youngest and most beloved daughter to the guillotine. Maria Theresa was the last great practitioner of the old style of dynastic politics. She saw her daughters as extensions of her own will, as instruments of the state. She loved them, but she also used them. She wove them into the very fabric of European royalty, creating a vast, interconnected family that would earn her the nickname the mother-in-law of Europe. She was a woman of immense power and of an iron will, a mother who, in her relentless pursuit of the security of her empire, was willing to sacrifice the personal happiness of her own children.
Marie Antoinette before the storm. In the gilded, sun-drenched halls of the Palace of Versailles, she was a vision of youth, of beauty, and of an almost otherworldly grace. She was Maria Antonia of Austria, a daughter of the mighty Empress Maria Theresa, who, at the age of 14, had been sent to France to become Marie Antoinette, the wife of the future King Louis XVI. Her arrival was the culmination of a brilliant and long-awaited diplomatic coup, an alliance between the two great rival houses of Bourbon and Habsburg. She was a symbol of a new era, of peace and of hope. But she was also a young, naive, and tragically unprepared girl, a lamb dressed in silk and jewels being led into a glittering and dangerous labyrinth from which she would never escape. Her early life in the Austrian court had been a relatively relaxed and informal one. She was the 15th of 16 children, and she was not raised with the intense, rigorous discipline of an heir to the throne. She was charming, she was vivacious, she was pretty, but she was also poorly educated and somewhat frivolous, with a love of music, of dancing, of fashion, and of the simple, carefree pleasures of life. The transition to the French court was a profound and brutal shock. Versailles was not just a palace, it was a complex and unforgiving machine, governed by a rigid and suffocatingly formal etiquette that had been established by Louis XIV a century earlier. Every aspect of her life, from the moment she woke up until the moment she went to sleep, was a public performance, governed by 1,000 tiny, unwritten rules. The simple act of getting dressed in the morning, the levée, was a public ceremony, attended by a crowd of high-ranking noblewomen, all of whom had the hereditary right to hand the new Dauphine her shift or her gloves. She was a foreigner, l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, and she was viewed with deep suspicion and resentment by many at the French court, who saw the alliance with their traditional enemy Austria as a betrayal. She was lonely, she was homesick, and she found her husband, the Dauphin Louis, to be a shy, awkward, and deeply unromantic young man. Their marriage, for the first 7 years, would be unconsummated, a source of intense personal humiliation and of great political anxiety for both the French and the Austrian courts.
To cope with this cold and hostile environment, Marie Antoinette created her own private world,
a small, intimate circle of friends, and a fantasy life of pleasure and escape. She retreated to the Petit Trianon, a small chateau in the grounds of Versailles, where she could dispense with the crushing etiquette of the main court. She built a model village, the Hameau de la Reine, a rustic, idealized peasant hamlet where she and her ladies-in-waiting could play at being milkmaids and shepherdesses, a charming but dangerously tone-deaf fantasy in a country where the real peasants were beginning to starve. She became a leader of fashion, her elaborate hairstyles and her extravagant, custom-made gowns the talk of Europe. She indulged in gambling, in amateur theatricals, in a life of seemingly endless parties and pleasures. Her behavior, while relatively innocent, was seen by the public as frivolous, extravagant, and proof of her foreign decadence. Vicious, pornographic pamphlets, the Libellé, began to circulate in Paris, accusing her of infidelity, of lesbianism, of treason, of every imaginable vice. She became a lightning rod for all the popular resentment against the monarchy, against the aristocracy, against a system that was seen as corrupt, out of touch, and bankrupt. She was a young woman who was born into a role she did not choose and was not equipped to play. She was a product of the old dynastic system, a system that saw her as a political pawn, not as a person. She was a daughter of a great empire, sent to be the queen of another, and she arrived in France at the precise historical moment when that entire ancient world of kings and of queens was beginning to crumble. She was a symbol of a dying age, a beautiful, tragic, and ultimately doomed figure, dancing in the candlelight of Versailles, blissfully unaware of the great, dark, and bloody storm that was gathering just beyond the palace gates.
The Spanish Habsburgs' decline. In the long and often tragic history of Europe's royal families, there is no more stark or more cautionary tale of the devastating consequences of systematic inbreeding than the story of the decline and fall of the Spanish Habsburgs. For 200 years, this mighty dynasty ruled over a global empire, a realm so vast that it was said the sun never set upon it. But while their empire was expanding, their own genetic heritage was contracting, their bloodline turning in on itself with each successive cousin marriage, until it produced a final, tragic, and grotesque caricature of a king, a man who was the living embodiment of his family's long, slow, and agonizing decay. The Spanish Habsburgs, from the very beginning, had pursued a relentless policy of marrying their own close relatives, primarily from the Austrian branch of the family. The goal was to keep their vast inheritance intact, to preserve the purity of their sacred blood. But with each generation, the genetic load of harmful, recessive genes became heavier and heavier. The family became a living laboratory, a closed system that demonstrated with horrifying clarity the biological price of their political strategy.
The physical and mental health of the line visibly deteriorated with each successive monarch. They were plagued by a host of ailments. The infamous Habsburg jaw became more and more pronounced until it was a severe and debilitating deformity. They suffered from high rates of infant mortality, from epilepsy, from depression, from a host of other conditions that pointed to a deep, systemic, and congenital weakness. The culmination of this long, sad story of decline was the final Spanish Habsburg king, Charles II, who ascended to the throne in 1665. He was, in a very real sense, the sum of all his ancestors' genetic errors. His father was the uncle of his mother. His own genetic makeup was more inbred than that of a child of a brother-sister union. He was a deeply, tragically, and visibly unwell man from the moment of his birth. He was known as El Hechizado, the hexed, for it seemed to the superstitious people of Spain that he must be the victim of a powerful curse. He was physically disabled, his legs were weak, and he could barely walk. He was mentally disabled, with a limited intelligence and a childlike, petulant temperament. He suffered from seizures, and he was afflicted with the most extreme version of the Habsburg jaw in the family's history. It was so pronounced that he could not chew his food properly, and his long, lolling tongue made his speech almost incomprehensible. He was a pathetic and pitiable figure, a king who was a biological and a political disaster.
His entire reign was a long, slow, and humiliating death watch. The great question that hung over the courts of Europe was, could Charles produce an heir? He was married twice, to two beautiful and intelligent princesses, but he was almost certainly sterile, another likely consequence of his profound genetic defects. The great powers of Europe, France, Austria, England, began to circle the ailing Spanish Empire like vultures, waiting for the death of the king to trigger a great, continent-spanning war for his vast inheritance, the War of the Spanish Succession. Charles II finally died in 1700, at the age of 38, a sick, senile, and broken man. With him, the Spanish branch of the mighty House of Habsburg, which had once ruled the world, came to a sad, inglorious, and genetically inevitable end. He was the final, tragic face of a dynasty that had, in its obsessive quest for purity, managed to systematically and irrevocably poison its own bloodline. The long, slow, and silent war of attrition that had been waged for centuries in the chromosomes of the Spanish kings was finally over.
British royal blood ties. The story of royal inbreeding is not confined to the Catholic monarchies of the continent. The Protestant royal houses of Britain and of Germany were also caught in the same self-referential web of dynastic marriage, their choices limited by the religious and political realities of the age. While the British royals were spared the kind of extreme, systematic, and ultimately catastrophic inbreeding that destroyed the Spanish Habsburgs, their own family tree is a dense and tangled thicket of cousin marriages, a testament to the same obsession with bloodlines, alliances, and the preservation of a small, exclusive, and royal gene pool. After the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the British Parliament, in its desire to secure a Protestant succession to the throne, passed the Act of Settlement in 1701. This act specifically barred any Catholic from inheriting the crown. This had the immediate and dramatic effect of disqualifying the dozens of closer Catholic relatives of the reigning monarch, Queen Anne, and of passing the throne to a relatively obscure and distant Protestant cousin from Germany, the Elector of Hanover.
This act, while it secured the Protestant succession, also dramatically shrank the pool of acceptable marriage partners for the new Hanoverian dynasty and for the British royal family for the next 2 centuries. A British prince or princess now had to marry a Protestant, and the only available Protestant royals were to be found in the small, numerous, and highly intermarried princely and ducal houses of Germany. And so began a long and steady importation of German cousins to be the spouses of British monarchs and their children. George I, the first Hanoverian king, was married to his first cousin. His son, George II, was also married to a German princess. The tradition was firmly established. The British royal family became, in essence, a German family that happened to reign in Britain. The most famous and most genetically significant of these unions was the marriage of Queen Victoria to her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Theirs was a genuine and passionate love match, but it was also a classic example of the kind of close, consanguineous marriage that had been the norm in royal families for centuries. Victoria and Albert had 9 children, and they would, in turn, be married off to other Protestant royals across the continent.
spreading their shared genetic heritage throughout the royal houses of Germany, of Russia, of Spain, of Sweden, of Norway. Victoria would become known as the grandmother of Europe. The most fateful and most tragic consequence of this vast interconnected web of British and German blood was the spread of a single, tiny, and deadly flaw in the royal genetic code. Queen Victoria was a carrier of the gene for hemophilia, a rare X-linked genetic disorder that prevents the blood from clotting properly. For a woman who has two X chromosomes, being a carrier is usually not a problem, as the healthy gene on her other X chromosome compensates. But she can pass the faulty gene on to her children. A son who inherits the gene will be a hemophiliac, a bleeder, for whom a simple cut or a bruise can be a life-threatening event. A daughter who inherits the gene will, like her mother, be a carrier, able to spread the royal disease to the next generation. And this is precisely what happened. The hemophilia gene, passed down from Queen Victoria, would travel through her daughters and her granddaughters into the royal families of Spain and, most tragically of all, of Russia, where the young Tsarevich Alexei, a great-grandson of Victoria, would suffer from the disease. A private, family tragedy that would have vast and catastrophic public consequences. The story of the British royal blood ties is a powerful reminder that even a love match, when it takes place within a small and restricted gene pool, can have unforeseen and history-altering consequences.
The frailty of princes and princesses. The royal nursery, with its silk-draped cradles, its hand-carved wooden toys, and its teams of wet nurses and servants, should have been the safest and most protected place in the kingdom. But in the inbred world of the European dynasties, the nursery was often a place of profound anxiety, of quiet, desperate prayer, and of a heartbreakingly frequent and familiar sorrow. The children of the crown, the precious heirs upon whom the future of the kingdom depended, were often born with a deep constitutional frailty, a congenital weakness that made their survival a constant and uncertain struggle. This frailty was the direct, if poorly understood, result of generations of cousin marriages. The same genetic lottery that produced the Habsburg jaw also produced a host of less visible but far more dangerous defects. The royal children often had weakened immune systems, making them incredibly susceptible to the common and often deadly diseases of the age. A simple cold, which a robust peasant child might shake off in a week, could develop into a fatal pneumonia in a royal prince. An outbreak of measles or of smallpox, which would sweep through the general population, would often cut a devastating swath through the royal nursery. The doctors, with their limited knowledge, were often helpless. They would try their usual remedies, the bleeding, the purging, the strange herbal concoctions, but these often did more harm than good, further weakening an already fragile child. The parents, the king and the queen, could do nothing but watch and pray and grieve. The letters and the diaries of the royal families are filled with the sad, repetitive story of the death of a child. The little prince was taken by a fever last night. The infant princess, who was ever of a delicate constitution, has been commended to God. This constant presence of death in the nursery had a profound effect on the emotional lives of the royal parents. It fostered a certain kind of emotional detachment, a defensive posture against the almost inevitable pain of loss. But it was also a source of immense and often private grief. A queen might give birth to 10 or 12 children, but see only a handful survive to adulthood. Each loss was a fresh wound, a personal tragedy that was also a public dynastic failure.
And for the children who did survive, life was often a long and difficult struggle with poor health. They were plagued by a host of chronic, debilitating, and often undiagnosed ailments. They might suffer from digestive problems, from seizures, from developmental delays. The Spanish king, Philip IV, a product of intense Habsburg inbreeding, was described as being perpetually listless, melancholic, and apathetic, a man with a deep and profound lack of vitality. This frailty was a terrible paradox. These children were, in theory, the pinnacle of the human race, the carriers of the most sacred and most noble blood on earth. They were surrounded by every imaginable form of wealth and of care, and yet they were often weaker, sickler, and more likely to die than the children of the poorest peasant on their lands. The hidden cost of the pure bloodline was a deep biological impurity, a congenital sadness that haunted the gilded cradles of the royal nursery and often followed the frail princes and the princesses all the way to their early graves.
Hemophilia and Queen Victoria's line. In the vast and complex genetic tapestry woven by the royal families of Europe, there is one thread that is particularly dark, tragic, and historically significant. It is the thread of hemophilia, a rare and devastating genetic disorder that was passed down from a single, unsuspecting source, Queen Victoria of Great Britain, to poison the bloodlines of some of the most powerful dynasties on the continent. The story of the royal disease is a powerful and intimate illustration of the hidden and often catastrophic costs of the royal marriage system. Hemophilia is a disease of the blood. In a healthy person, a complex chain reaction of proteins or clotting factors causes the blood to coagulate and to form a scab after an injury. In a person with hemophilia, one of these essential clotting factors is missing. Their blood does not clot properly. A small cut can bleed for hours. A minor bruise can lead to a massive, painful, and dangerous internal hemorrhage. A simple tooth extraction can be a life-threatening event. It is a life lived in constant, careful avoidance of the smallest of injuries. A life overshadowed by the fear of a sudden, uncontrollable bleed.
The disease is caused by a faulty gene on the X chromosome. It is a recessive X-linked disorder. This means that it primarily affects men. A man who has only one X chromosome will be a hemophiliac if he inherits the faulty gene. A woman who has two X chromosomes will usually be a healthy carrier if she inherits one faulty gene, as the normal gene on her other X chromosome will compensate. She will not suffer from the disease herself, but she can pass the faulty gene on to her children. There is a 50% chance that her son will be a hemophiliac, and a 50% chance that her daughter will be a carrier. Queen Victoria was a carrier. The faulty gene appears to have been a spontaneous mutation in either her or her father. She herself was healthy, but she passed the gene on to at least 3 of her 9 children. Her son, Leopold, was a hemophiliac, a frail and sickly man who would die at the age of 30 from a brain hemorrhage after a fall. 2 of her daughters, Alice and Beatrice, were carriers. And it was through these 2 daughters and their own dynastic marriages that the royal disease was spread across Europe. They were loving mothers who, unknowingly, passed on their own hidden genetic curse. Princess Alice, who married the Grand Duke of Hesse, passed the gene to her daughter, Alex, and Alex would become the Tsarina Alexandra of Russia, the wife of Tsar Nicholas II. She, in turn, passed the gene to her only son, the precious heir to the Russian throne, the young Tsarevich Alexei. The story of the Russian monarchy in its final, tragic years
is inextricably linked to Alexei's hemophilia. The desperate attempts by the Tsarina to find a cure for her son's agonizing and life-threatening condition would lead her to fall under the influence of the charismatic and corrupt mystic Rasputin, a relationship that would fatally discredit the monarchy in the eyes of the Russian people and would be a major contributing factor to the Russian Revolution.
Princess Beatrice passed the gene into the Spanish royal family. Her daughter, Victoria Eugenie, a carrier, married King Alfonso XIII of Spain. Two of their sons were hemophiliacs, their lives a constant struggle with the disease, a source of immense grief for the family and a destabilizing factor for the already fragile Spanish monarchy. The story of the royal hemophilia is a powerful and intimate human tragedy. It is the story of mothers who passed on a terrible inheritance to their children. It is the story of young boys who were forced to live a life of pain and of restriction. But it is also a story with vast and unforeseen historical consequences. The tiny, flawed gene on Queen Victoria's X chromosome would play a small but not insignificant role in the downfall of two of the greatest empires in Europe, a stark and chilling testament to the fact that the hidden, invisible world of genetics can sometimes shape the great, visible world of history.
The silent burden of stillbirths. In the grand public narrative of a royal dynasty, the story is one of glorious births, of healthy heirs, of a bloodline that stretches, strong and unbroken, into the future. But behind the closed doors of the royal bedchamber, and in the quiet, hidden grief of the queen, there is another, much darker and more silent story. It is the story of the pregnancies that did not end in a live birth, the story of the miscarriages and the stillbirths that were a constant, heartbreaking, and often unrecorded feature of royal life. This silent burden of loss was one of the heaviest and most painful prices paid for the obsession with the purity of the bloodline. The life of a royal woman was, in many ways, a life of perpetual pregnancy. From the moment of her marriage, often in her early teens, until the end of her childbearing years, a queen was expected to be in a constant cycle of conception, of pregnancy, and of childbirth. Her value to the dynasty was measured almost exclusively by her fertility. Each pregnancy was a matter of intense state interest, a subject of public prayer and of private political anxiety. But in the inbred world of the European monarchies, a successful pregnancy was far from a certainty. The same genetic factors that led to the high rates of infant and child mortality also led to an equally high and often higher rate of fetal death. The concentration of harmful recessive genes would often result in a fetus with such severe developmental problems that it was simply not viable.
A queen might announce her pregnancy to the great joy and relief of the court, but a few months later she would suffer a miscarriage. This was a private, physical, and emotional trauma for the woman, but it was also a public political disappointment. The hopes of the kingdom would be dashed, and the queen would be expected to begin the process all over again. Even more heartbreaking was the stillbirth. A queen would endure the entire long and often difficult 9 months of a pregnancy. She would go through the terrifying and agonizing ordeal of childbirth, an event that was in itself a life-threatening one in the age before modern medicine. And at the end of it all, the child would be born dead. These events were often shrouded in a kind of official silence. The public announcements, if they were made at all, would be brief and euphemistic. The queen would be said to be indisposed. The court would go into a brief period of quiet mourning, but the true, deep, personal grief of the mother was something she was expected to bear in private, and with a stoic, royal dignity. There was little room for personal sorrow in a world where her body was seen as a public utility, a vessel for the production of heirs. The story of the Spanish Habsburgs is particularly tragic in this regard. Modern statistical analysis of their family tree has shown that they had a staggeringly high rate of infant and fetal mortality. It is estimated that a full half of all Habsburg conceptions did not result in a child that survived past the age of 10. A queen like Mariana of Austria, the wife of Philip IV of Spain, endured 6 pregnancies, but only 2 of her children survived to adulthood, and one of them was the tragically disabled Charles II. Her life was a long and almost unimaginable saga of repeated, heartbreaking loss. This silent burden of stillbirths and miscarriages was a hidden and deeply personal part of the dark side of inbreeding. It was a secret history of grief written in the bodies of the royal women, a constant, tragic, and often unspoken counterpoint to the grand public narrative of dynastic power and of glorious succession.
The psychological toll. The life of a royal daughter was a life lived in a gilded cage. She was surrounded by the most exquisite luxury, by the most refined art, by a level of material comfort that was almost unimaginable to the vast majority of the population. But this glittering, privileged existence came at an immense and often devastating psychological cost. The relentless pressure, the profound lack of freedom, and the crushing weight of dynastic duty could take a terrible toll on the mind and the spirit, leaving a legacy of loneliness, of depression, and of quiet, desperate, and often broken lives. The first and most fundamental psychological burden was the complete and total lack of personal autonomy. From the moment of her birth, a princess's life was not her own. It was a carefully managed project, a strategic asset belonging to her father and to the state. Her education, her friendships, her daily routines, and most importantly, her marriage were all decided for her based on the cold, hard calculus of political advantage. She had no say in her own future. This created a profound and often deeply frustrating sense of powerlessness, a feeling of being a passive object in a game played by powerful men. The second burden was the profound and inescapable loneliness. A princess was never truly alone, but she was almost always lonely. She was constantly surrounded by a retinue of ladies-in-waiting, of servants, of guards. But these were not true friends. They were employees. They were chaperones. Loneliness was often intensified when she was married off and sent to a foreign court. She would arrive, a young and often frightened girl, in a land whose language she barely spoke, whose customs she did not understand. She was a stranger, an outsider, often viewed with suspicion and resentment. Her new husband was a stranger. Her new family was a collection of political allies or rivals. The isolation could be crushing. The pressure to produce an heir was another source of immense and constant anxiety. Her entire value, her very security in her new home, depended on her ability to give birth to a healthy son. Each month that passed without a pregnancy was a source of mounting stress. Each miscarriage or stillbirth was a public failure, a source of personal grief and of political despair. Her body was not her own. It was a public vessel, its successes and failures the subject of intense scrutiny and of court-wide gossip.
In this high-pressure, low autonomy, and emotionally barren environment, it is not surprising that many royal women suffered from what we would now recognize as clinical depression. The historical records are filled with accounts of princesses who were described as being perpetually melancholic, who would spend days in their chambers weeping, who would lose all interest in the world around them. One of the Mad is the most extreme example,
But her story is just a more dramatic version of a much more common and much quieter form of suffering. The psychological toll of being a royal daughter was the hidden, invisible cost of the dynastic system. It was a system that demanded the complete and total sacrifice of the individual for the good of the house. It was a system that often produced queens who were outwardly polished, dignified, and serene, but who were, on the inside, lonely, anxious, and deeply, quietly, and incurably sad.
Marriage as sacrifice. In the cold, pragmatic, and high-stakes world of European dynastic politics, marriage was not a union of two hearts. It was a merger of two kingdoms. For a royal daughter, the wedding ceremony was not the culmination of a romance. It was the beginning of a lifelong sacrifice, a personal and often painful offering on the altar of statecraft. The concept of love, of personal affection, of companionship was a rare and often accidental byproduct of a transaction that was, at its core, purely political. The process began with the marriage negotiations, a long, slow, and complex dance of diplomacy that could last for years. The princess herself was the primary subject of these negotiations, but she was not a participant. She was the prize. Ambassadors and ministers would travel back and forth between the courts, haggling over the terms of the contract. The size of her dowry was a key point of contention. The political and military clauses of the alliance were debated endlessly. The princess would be scrutinized from afar. A court painter would be dispatched to paint her portrait, a crucial piece of data in the negotiation. The artist was under immense pressure to produce a flattering but not entirely dishonest image. The portrait would be sent to the prospective groom and his family to be examined for signs of beauty, of health, and of fertility. The princess, in turn, would be shown a portrait of her future husband, a stiff, formal, and often highly idealized image of a man she had never met. This exchange of portraits was the closest thing to a courtship that she would ever know.
When the treaty was finally signed, the marriage would often take place by proxy. The princess would stand at the altar in her own country, and a high-ranking nobleman would stand in for the absent groom. This legal ceremony would bind her, for life, to a man who was hundreds of miles away. Then came the journey. The princess would leave her home, her family, her friends, everything she had ever known, and she would travel for weeks or even months to her new country. This journey was a slow, formal, and often emotionally wrenching transition from one identity to another. At the border of her new kingdom, a ceremony of handover would often take place. She would be formally stripped of her old clothes, of her old attendants, of every last vestige of her former life. She would be redressed in the style of her new country. She would be given a new household of strangers, and she would cross the border, no longer a princess of her own land, but the property of another.
The first meeting with her new husband was a moment of immense and public anxiety. The couple would often meet for the first time on their wedding day, surrounded by the entire court, their first awkward interactions the subject of intense scrutiny. The wedding night itself was a public, political act, often witnessed in some symbolic way by members of the court to ensure that the marriage had been legally consummated and the alliance was secure. For some, by a stroke of pure luck, affection and even love might eventually grow between the royal couple. The shared duties, the shared life, the shared children could forge a genuine bond. The marriage of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert is a famous example of a royal match that was also a deep and passionate love story. But for many, perhaps for most, the marriage was a cold and lonely duty. The husband might be old, or ugly, or cruel. He might be indifferent to his new wife, preferring the company of his mistresses.
The queen's life would be a long and quiet endurance, a performance of a role, her own emotional needs and desires completely sublimated to the demands of the dynasty. Her marriage was not her life, it was her job, and it was a job that required the complete and total sacrifice of her own heart.
When dynasties collapsed. A dynasty is more than just a family. It is a living institution, the central pillar that supports the entire structure of the kingdom. The continuity of the bloodline is the guarantee of stability, of legitimacy, of the divinely ordained order of the world. But a dynasty is also a biological entity, and like any living thing, it can grow sick, it can weaken, and it can die. And in the inbred world of European royalty, the slow, insidious, and often invisible decay caused by generations of cousin marriages was a powerful and often decisive factor in the collapse of some of the greatest houses in history. The process of collapse was often a long, slow, and agonizing one, a multi-generational slide into biological and political irrelevance. It would begin in the quiet, tragic theater of the royal nursery. The high rates of infant mortality, the constant miscarriages and stillbirths, the frailty of the surviving children, these were the first ominous signs that the bloodline was beginning to fail. A dynasty that cannot reliably produce healthy heirs is a dynasty that is already in crisis.
As the surviving heirs grew to adulthood, the problems would often become more visible. The physical deformities, like the Habsburg jaw, were a public and embarrassing sign of the family's congenital weakness. But it was the less visible problems that were often more politically damaging. The mental and emotional instability, the bouts of deep melancholy, the lack of energy and of intellectual vigor, these were not the qualities of a strong and effective ruler. A king who was seen as weak, as indecisive, as mentally unsound, was a king who could not command the respect of his own nobles or the fear of his enemies. The kingdom would begin to drift, to lose its way, its leadership paralyzed by the biological failings of its monarch. The ultimate crisis was the failure of the line itself. This was the great existential terror of every dynasty, the prospect of the king dying without a clear, legitimate, and healthy male heir to succeed him. When this happened, it would create a power vacuum, a moment of extreme and dangerous instability.
The stage would be set for a succession crisis. Distant cousins, rival branches of the family, the husbands of royal princesses, all would begin to press their own, often tenuous claims to the throne. The great nobles of the realm would choose sides, forming factions and private armies, and the other great powers of Europe, always watching for a sign of weakness, would begin to interfere, to back their own preferred candidate, to see the crisis as an opportunity to expand their own influence. The result was often a long, bloody, and devastating civil war. The War of the Roses in England, the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession. Many of the great continent-spanning conflicts of European history were, at their heart, dynastic disputes, triggered by the biological failure of a royal house. The collapse of a dynasty was therefore a multifaceted event. It was a genetic decline, a slow internal poisoning of the bloodline through inbreeding. It was a political decline, as the weakness of the rulers led to instability and a loss of authority. And it often culminated in a military catastrophe, a civil or an international war that would tear the kingdom apart. The story of the fall of the great houses is a stark and powerful reminder that the fate of nations, the lives of millions of people, could depend entirely on the small, secret, and often tragic events that took place in the royal bedchamber.
The end of the Spanish line. The great, gilded, and echoing halls of the Alcázar of Madrid in the late 17th century
were the stage for the final, tragic, and almost Gothic act in the long drama of the Spanish Habsburgs. The Spanish Empire was still, in theory, the greatest power on earth, a vast global conglomeration of territories. But at its heart, in the person of its king, it was rotten, a hollowed-out and decaying shell. The king was Charles II, and his life and his death were the final, agonizing chapter in the story of a dynasty that had systematically and with a terrible logical precision bred itself into extinction. Charles II, known to his long-suffering people as El Hechizado, the Hixt, was the living, breathing, and barely functioning embodiment of 2 centuries of intensive inbreeding. His genetic inheritance was a catastrophic tangle of repeated ancestral lines. His coefficient of inbreeding was so high that it was as if he were the child of a brother and a sister. He was a biological dead end, a man whose very existence was a testament to the fatal flaws of his family's marital strategy.
From his birth, he was a source of profound and constant anxiety. He was a frail and sickly child, plagued by a host of illnesses. He did not walk until he was 8 years old. He did not speak until he was 4. His mental development was severely delayed, and he remained, in many ways, a child for his entire life, prone to tantrums and simple-minded pleasures. And he was the living caricature of the Habsburg physical traits. The famous Habsburg jaw was so pronounced in him that his upper and lower teeth did not meet, making it almost impossible for him to chew his food. His tongue was so large that it caused him to drool and made his speech a thick, barely intelligible mumble. He was a pitiable, almost grotesque figure, a king who, through no fault of his own, inspired not awe, but a mixture of pity and revulsion. His entire reign, which lasted for 35 years, was a long, slow, and humiliating period of national decline, presided over by a king who was a king in name only. The real power was held by his mother, by his wives, and by the powerful court factions who battled for control of the weak and indecisive monarch.
The central and most urgent question that dominated the politics of Europe for decades was a simple and deeply personal one. Could Charles produce an heir? The survival of the Spanish Empire and the peace of the continent depended on it. He was married twice, first to the beautiful French princess Marie-Louise of Orleans, and then to the formidable German princess Maria Anna of Neuburg. Both marriages were childless. Charles was almost certainly impotent and definitively sterile, a final, cruel twist of his genetic inheritance. As Charles grew older and his health visibly deteriorated, the courts of Europe began to circle. The great question of the Spanish succession became the single, obsessive focus of international diplomacy. The 2 main claimants to the vast Spanish throne were the Bourbon dynasty of France and the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs, both of whom had complex, legitimate claims through their own marriages to Spanish infantas. The other powers, like England and the Dutch Republic, maneuvered desperately to prevent either of their great rivals from gaining the immense power that would come with the Spanish inheritance. Charles II finally died in November of 1700, a few weeks before his 39th birthday. He was a broken, senile, and childless man. His death was the final, merciful end to a life of suffering. But it was also the trigger for the catastrophe that Europe had long feared. His will named the French Bourbon candidate as his heir. The Austrian Habsburgs refused to accept it, and the War of the Spanish Succession, a great, continent-spanning conflict that would last for over a decade and would kill hundreds of thousands of people, began. The long, slow, and silent process of genetic decay within a single royal family had finally erupted into a conflagration that would engulf an entire continent. Russian princesses and fragile health. In the vast, cold, and opulent palaces of St. Petersburg, the Romanov dynasty ruled over the immense and often turbulent Russian Empire with an autocratic power that was almost absolute. But behind the glittering facade of imperial grandeur, behind the jewel-encrusted icons and the magnificent court balls, the private lives of the Romanovs were often a story of quiet, persistent, and heartbreaking fragility. The imperial family, like their royal cousins across Europe, was not immune to the hidden costs of a restricted and often politically motivated gene pool, and their story is one of a recurring and often tragic struggle with the delicate health of their own children. The Romanovs, particularly from the 18th century onwards, looked to the small, numerous, and highly intermarried Protestant princely houses of Germany for their brides. A German princess was seen as the ideal wife for a future czar. She was well-bred, she was Protestant, and thus could be converted to Russian Orthodoxy, and she was from a house that was not powerful enough to pose a political threat to Russia. This tradition, which was meant to bring new blood and stability to the dynasty, in fact, created a deep and lasting genetic link to the same small and often fragile gene pool that supplied the other royal houses of Europe.
The result was a recurring pattern of delicate health among the imperial children. The letters and the diaries of the czars and the czarinas are filled with a constant, anxious concern for the health of their offspring. The imperial nursery at the Winter Palace was a place of obsessive care, of hushed tones, and of a constant low-level fear of the fevers, the coughs, and the fluxes that could so easily carry away a fragile child. The wives of the czars were often particularly affected. Many of the German princesses who came to Russia seemed to suffer from a kind of constitutional melancholy, a combination of physical frailty and a deep psychological unease. They were often carriers of the nerve diseases, the vague but debilitating nervous conditions that were a common feature of the 19th century European aristocracy. The Tsarina Alexandra, the wife of the last Tsar, Nicholas II, was a classic example. She was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and she brought with her not just the gene for hemophilia, but a deeply nervous, anxious, and mystical temperament that would make her deeply unpopular with the Russian people and would lead her to make a series of disastrous political decisions. But the most famous and most tragic story of fragile health in the Romanov family is, of course, the story of the Tsarevich Alexei. He was the long-awaited male heir to the throne, the only son of Nicholas and Alexandra. And he was a hemophiliac. He had inherited the royal disease from his mother, a genetic legacy that had traveled from the foggy shores of England to the icy heart of the Russian Empire. The life of the young Alexei was a constant and terrifying ordeal. A simple bump or a fall, the inevitable accidents of a normal childhood, could trigger the massive, painful, and life-threatening internal bleed. He would suffer for weeks, his joints swollen and locked in agony, his body racked with pain. The entire vast machinery of the imperial court would grind to a halt, its focus narrowed to the sickbed of this one small and desperately ill boy. The desperation of his mother, the Tsarina Alexandra, to find a cure, to find any relief for her son's suffering, would lead her to the charismatic and corrupt Siberian mystic, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin seemed to have an almost hypnotic ability to calm the boy and, somehow, to stop the bleeding. His influence over the Tsarina, and through her over the Tsar and the Russian government, would become a national scandal. It was a major factor in the delegitimization of the monarchy and the slide towards the Russian Revolution. The story of the Romanovs is a powerful and tragic reminder of how the private, hidden world of genetics and of family health
can have vast and catastrophic public consequences. The fragile health of the Russian princesses and the single, flawed gene that they carried from Germany and from England would play a crucial and ultimately fatal role in the downfall of one of the greatest and most powerful dynasties of history.
The Austro-Hungarian echoes. By the 19th century, the great House of Habsburg was no longer the global superpower it had once been, but it still ruled over the vast, multi-ethnic, and increasingly unstable Austro-Hungarian Empire from its magnificent capital, Vienna. And the family was still haunted by the long, dark, and persistent echoes of its own genetic history. The extreme systematic inbreeding of the Spanish line was a thing of the past, but the Austrian branch of the family continued to be a world of cousin marriages, of delicate health, and of a pervasive, almost romantic sense of melancholy and of doom. The central figures of the late Habsburg world are the Emperor Franz Joseph I and his beautiful, enigmatic, and deeply tragic wife, the Empress Elizabeth, known to her family and to history as Sisi. Theirs was a love match, a rare departure from the usual arranged marriages of the dynasty. Franz Joseph was meant to marry Sisi's older, more sensible sister, but he fell in love at first sight with the beautiful, free-spirited, and 16-year-old Sisi.
But their love story would not have a happy ending. Sisi was a woman who was temperamentally and psychologically unsuited to the rigid, suffocating, and deeply formal etiquette of the Viennese court. She was a restless spirit, obsessed with her own beauty, with poetry, with horseback riding, with a romantic, almost morbid sense of her own tragic destiny. She suffered from what was likely a severe eating disorder, and she was plagued by bouts of deep depression. She was a woman who was slowly but surely broken by the gilded cage in which she was trapped. The tragedy of the family was compounded by the fate of their children. Their first daughter died in infancy, and their only son and heir, the Crown Prince Rudolf, was a deeply intelligent, sensitive, but also unstable and dissolute young man. He was a political liberal in constant conflict with his conservative father. He was trapped in an unhappy marriage, and in 1889, in a hunting lodge at Maryling, he and his young mistress died in a mysterious murder-suicide, a shocking and scandalous event that sent a tremor of horror through all the courts of Europe.
The death of Rudolf meant that the new heir to the vast and increasingly fragile empire was Franz Josef's nephew, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He too was a difficult and often irascible man, and he too would choose to marry for love, a decision that would have profound and catastrophic consequences. He married a Czech countess, Sophie Chotek, a woman who was considered to be of a far inferior social rank. It was a morganatic marriage, meaning that their children would not have the right to inherit the throne. This private family drama was a source of constant tension and humiliation within the imperial court. And it was this couple, the controversial heir and his morganatic wife, who, on a summer's day in 1914, would travel to the obscure Balkan city of Sarajevo. Their assassination by a Serbian nationalist would be the spark, the trigger that would ignite the long-simmering tensions of Europe and would plunge the continent into the cataclysm of the First World War. The story of the late Habsburgs is a story that is saturated with a sense of an ending. It is a story of a great and ancient dynasty, a dynasty that had ruled over Europe for 600 years, that was now visibly crumbling from within. It was a family plagued by a deep hereditary sadness, by a series of personal tragedies that seemed to echo the larger political decay of their empire. The final violent death of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo was not just a political assassination. It was the final, tragic, and bloody punctuation mark
at the end of a long, slow, and melancholic family saga. Whispers of divine punishment. In the deeply religious and often superstitious world of the European courts, the recurring pattern of tragedy that afflicted the great royal houses, the stillbirths, the sickly children, the physical deformities, the bouts of madness, was rarely seen through a purely medical or rational lens. For many, from the priests in the royal chapel to the common people who heard the whispered rumors from the palace, this relentless parade of suffering was not an accident of biology. It was a sign. It was a message from God. It was the whisper of a divine punishment, a curse that had been laid upon the great and the powerful for their sins. This belief was rooted in a worldview that saw the hand of God in every aspect of human life. In an age before the germ theory of disease or the science of genetics, a sudden sickness, a stillborn child, a physical deformity, these were not seen as random natural events. They were seen as expressions of the divine will, as a form of communication from a God who was actively and intimately involved in the affairs of mankind. The most common explanation was that the royal family was being punished for some great ancestral sin. Perhaps a long-dead king had usurped the throne, or had committed a terrible act of cruelty or of sacrilege. The sin may have been forgotten by men, but it was not forgotten by God. And the divine justice was a slow, patient, and inexorable thing, visiting the sins of the fathers upon the sons and upon the daughters unto the third and the fourth generation. The sickly prince, the mad queen, they were the innocent victims of a crime that had been committed a century ago, their suffering a form of cosmic and generational retribution.
The practice of inbreeding itself was often seen as the source of the curse. The church had long and complex rules, the laws of consanguinity, which forbade marriage between close relatives. The great royal families were constantly having to seek special dispensations from the Pope to allow their politically necessary but religiously problematic cousin marriages to go ahead. For many of the devout, these papal dispensations were a human circumvention of a divine law. They believed that God had forbidden such unions for a reason, and that the royal families, in their arrogance and their obsession with the purity of their own blood, were defying the will of God. The sickly, deformed, and sterile children that were born of these unions were seen as God's clear and terrible judgment on this prideful and unnatural practice.
When a royal child was born with a deformity, or when a queen suffered from a bout of madness, the court would be filled with whispers. The priests would preach sermons on the themes of divine wrath and the need for repentance. The courtiers would look for omens, for signs in the heavens or in the natural world that would confirm their fears. The common people would see the suffering of their rulers as a dark and terrifying portent for the fate of the kingdom itself. This belief in a divine punishment was a powerful and self-perpetuating idea. It provided a simple, satisfying, and morally coherent explanation for a series of events that were otherwise random and inexplicable. It transformed a story of biological decay into a great moral drama, a story of sin, of hubris, and of a just and terrible God. The whispers of a curse were more than just a piece of courtly gossip. They were a way of making sense of a world that seemed to be saturated with a deep, hereditary, and inescapable sorrow. Science reveals the truth. For centuries, the recurring pattern of frailty, of deformity, and of madness in the royal families of Europe was a profound and troubling mystery, explained away by whispers of divine curses, of bad blood, of a tragic and inescapable fate. But in the late 19th and the 20th centuries, a new and powerful way of understanding the world began to emerge. The quiet, patient, and revolutionary work of scientists in the fields of genetics and of medicine began to shine a new, rational, and often unforgiving light into the dark, secret corners of the royal bedchamber. The whispers of a curse were finally replaced by the clear, cold, and inescapable language of science. The revolution began in a quiet monastery garden in the 1860s with the work of an Augustinian friar named Gregor Mendel. Through his meticulous and now famous experiments with pea plants, Mendel discovered the fundamental laws of heredity. He demonstrated that traits were passed down from one generation to the next through discrete units, which we now call genes. He discovered the concepts of dominant and recessive traits. His work, which was largely ignored in his own lifetime, laid the absolute foundation for the modern science of genetics.
In the early 20th century, as Mendel's work was rediscovered, scientists began to understand the genetic basis of many inherited diseases. The mystery of hemophilia, the royal disease that had plagued the descendants of Queen Victoria, was finally solved. Scientists identified it as a recessive X-linked disorder, and they were able to trace the path of the faulty gene with a chilling precision, from Victoria herself, through her daughters, to the royal houses of Russia and of Spain. The curse was not a supernatural one. It was a small, specific, and identifiable flaw in a sequence of DNA. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, scientists have been able to look back at the most famous case of royal inbreeding, that of the Spanish Habsburgs, with a new set of powerful analytical tools. By conducting a detailed genealogical and statistical analysis of the Habsburg family tree, historians and geneticists have been able to calculate the coefficient of inbreeding for each member of the dynasty. Their findings are startling. They have shown a direct and statistically significant correlation between the level of inbreeding and the shockingly high rates of infant and child mortality in the family. They have also been able to offer a specific genetic diagnosis for the tragic last king, Charles II. It is now believed that he suffered from at least two rare recessive genetic disorders: pituitary hormone deficiency, which would explain his short stature and his delayed development, and distal renal tubular acidosis, a kidney disorder that would explain his many other reported illnesses. These were not random acts of fate. They were the direct, predictable, and almost inevitable consequence of 2 centuries of intensive inbreeding. The science has confirmed what the portraits have long suggested, that the Spanish Habsburgs were the victims of a slow, multi-generational, and self-inflicted genetic suicide. This new scientific understanding does not diminish the human tragedy of these stories. In many ways, it enhances it. It replaces the vague, romantic notion of a family curse with the clear, cold, and inescapable reality of a flawed and fragile biology. It allows us to see the royal daughters not just as pawns in a political game, but as the unwitting carriers and the often tragic victims of a set of genetic laws that they could neither understand nor control. Science has pulled back the heavy velvet curtain of myth and of superstition, and it has revealed the quiet, hidden, and deeply human truth of the double helix that was coiled at the very heart of the royal throne.
The lasting myths of cursed blood. Science may have revealed the genetic truth behind the tragedies of the royal families, but the old, powerful, and deeply resonant myths of cursed blood and of dynastic doom have not simply vanished. They have survived, transformed, and they continue to shape our popular understanding of history. These stories, with their potent mixture of grandeur, of tragedy, of love, and of madness, have become a part of our collective folklore, a set of modern fairy tales for a world that is still fascinated by the lives of kings and of queens. The story of Juana the Mad is a prime example. While historians now see her as a complex figure, a victim of her own passionate nature and of the ruthless political ambitions of the men around her, The popular imagination still clings to the more romantic and the more tragic image of the Mad Queen, her sanity shattered by a love that was too powerful to bear, eternally mourning over the coffin of her handsome, faithless husband. She has become a stock character, an archetype of the tragic, romantic, and emotionally fragile royal woman.
The story of the downfall of the Spanish Habsburgs is often told not as a dry clinical case study in the dangers of consanguinity, but as a grand Gothic melodrama. The final king, Charles II, the Hexed, is portrayed as the last accursed scion of a doomed and decadent house, his physical and mental deformities a kind of divine, almost literary justice for the sins of his ancestors. The story is not about recessive genes. It is about pride, about hubris, and about a great house that was brought down by the fatal, internal flaws of its own character. The story of the Romanovs, too, is steeped in this kind of myth-making. The hemophilia of the young Tsarevich Alexei is often seen not just as a medical condition, but as a symbol of the sickness of the entire Russian monarchy, a physical manifestation of its internal decay. The figure of Rasputin is elevated from a corrupt, opportunistic charlatan into a demonic, almost supernatural figure, a mad monk who held the entire imperial family in his thrall. The final, brutal execution of the family in a cellar in Ekaterinburg is seen as the inevitable, almost preordained final act in a great, tragic, and Russian opera.
These myths are so powerful and so enduring because they appeal to a deep human need for narrative, for meaning, for a sense of justice in the often random and chaotic unfolding of history. It is more satisfying to believe that a dynasty was brought down by a curse than by a statistical probability. It is more compelling to see a queen's suffering as the result of a tragic, star-crossed love than as the symptom of a neurological condition. These stories have been kept alive by centuries of art, of literature, of opera, of film. They have been transformed from complex historical events into powerful and easily digestible narratives. They have become a part of our shared cultural language. And so, the myths of the cursed blood continue to be told. They are a testament to the fact that even in our modern scientific age, we are still drawn to the old, powerful, and deeply human stories of fate, of doom, and of the great and the powerful being brought low by the secret, hidden flaws that are carried in their own, supposedly pure and often tragically compromised blood.
How royal women remembered themselves. The official history of the great royal houses is a history that is written by men for men. It is a story of battles, of treaties, of laws, of succession. In this grand public narrative, the royal women, the queens, the princesses, the royal daughters, are often reduced to a set of simple, functional roles. They are the breeders of heirs, the weavers of alliances, the decorative and silent partners to their powerful husbands and fathers. But if we listen closely, if we search in the quiet, dusty archives of the palaces, we can sometimes find another, more intimate and more personal history. It is a history that is written in their own words, in the letters, the diaries, and the private memoirs that have, by some miracle, survived the centuries. And in these precious, fragile documents, we can hear the voices of the royal women themselves, remembering their own lives, not as political symbols, but as human beings. Their letters are often a revelation. In an age of formal, stilted prose, the private correspondence between a royal mother and her daughter, or between two royal sisters, can be a place of surprising emotional honesty and of deep, genuine affection. The letters of the great Empress Maria Theresa to her many daughters are a fascinating and complex mixture of statecraft and of maternal love. In one paragraph, she will be giving her daughter, Marie Antoinette,
a stern lecture on her political duties as the Queen of France. But in the next, she will be worrying about her health, giving her advice on her pregnancies, expressing a deep and motherly concern for her happiness. These letters are a window into the complex and often contradictory role of the royal woman, a role that was constantly torn between the demands of the state and the impulses of the heart.
The diaries and the private journals are even more intimate. They are the spaces where a royal woman could, for a brief and secret moment, take off the heavy public mask of her royal role and be herself. The diary of a young princess might be filled with the same hopes, fears, and romantic longings as that of any other teenage girl. She might write of her secret crush on a handsome young courtier, of her frustration with her strict governess, of her deep and often painful loneliness in the formal adult world of the court. The journals of an older, married queen are often a record of a quiet and stoic endurance. She might write of her disappointment in her often unfaithful husband, of her constant anxiety over the health of her fragile children, of the crushing boredom and the stifling formality of her daily life. These are not complaints. They are quiet, private, and often deeply melancholic reflections, a way of processing a life that is filled with immense privilege, but is often lacking in genuine emotional fulfillment.
These private writings are also a testament to the intelligence and the resilience of these women. We see their sharp observations of the political intrigues of the court. We see their deep and often frustrated understanding of the great political events of their time. We see their courage in the face of constant illness, of repeated childbirth, of profound personal loss. We see that they were not just passive pawns in a man's world. They were intelligent, observant, and often deeply courageous women who found ways to navigate, to endure, and sometimes even to thrive in the gilded cage in which they were placed. To read these private documents is a deeply moving and humanizing experience. It is to hear the quiet, forgotten voices of the women who were so often silent in the grand public histories. It is to understand that behind the stiff formal portraits, behind the titles and the crowns, there were real women with real hearts who remembered their own lives not as a series of treaties and of alliances, but as a long and often difficult and deeply personal journey of the soul.
The modern royals shift. The world of the European royal families in the 20th and 21st centuries is a world that would be almost unrecognizable to their ancestors. The great autocratic empires have crumbled, replaced by constitutional monarchies, where the king or the queen reigns but does not rule. The old, ruthless, and high-stakes game of dynastic politics has been rendered obsolete by the new realities of democracy and of diplomacy. And in this new and much smaller world, the ancient and often brutal rules that govern the lives of the royal daughters have been slowly but surely rewritten. The single, most profound, and most revolutionary change has been the triumph of a single, simple, and once unthinkable idea: the idea of marrying for love. The shift did not happen overnight. It was a slow, gradual, and often contested evolution. For much of the 20th century, the old ways still held a powerful sway. The marriage of a future monarch was still seen as a matter of immense national importance, and the choice of a bride was still subject to a host of ancient and often unwritten rules. She had to be of royal, or at least high aristocratic blood. She had to be of the correct religion. She had to have an impeccable, scandal-free past. The pool of suitable candidates was still, in many ways, a small and exclusive one.
The abdication of King Edward VIII of the United Kingdom in 1936 was a seismic event that highlighted this clash between the old world and the new. He was forced to give up his throne because he was determined to marry Wallis Simpson, an American, a commoner, and a divorcee, a woman who was, by every traditional standard, a completely unsuitable bride for a king. His choice of personal love over public duty was seen as a shocking and unforgivable betrayal of the ancient code. But in the decades that followed the Second World War, as society itself became more democratic, more informal, and more focused on the ideal of romantic love, the pressure on the royal houses to adapt became irresistible. The old, rigid rules began to soften. The marriage of Prince Rainier of Monaco to the American film star Grace Kelly in 1956 was a glamorous and headline-grabbing sign of the changing times. The marriage of the future King Harald V of Norway to Sonja Haraldsson, a commoner, in 1968, after a 9-year struggle to win the approval of his father and the Norwegian government, was another, quieter, but equally significant milestone.
The great turning point for the British royal family was the marriage of Prince Charles to Lady Diana Spencer in 1981. While Diana was an aristocrat, she was not a royal, and their ill-fated union, with its fairy tale beginning and its tragic public collapse, exposed the deep human cost of a marriage that was based on dynastic duty rather than on genuine compatibility and affection. The lesson was learned. In the next generation, the shift became complete. The marriages of Prince William to Catherine Middleton and of Prince Harry to Meghan Markle, both women with no aristocratic background, have cemented the new reality. The primary qualification for a royal spouse is no longer the purity of their bloodline, but the genuineness of their love for the heir to the throne. This new freedom has transformed the lives of the modern royal women. They are no longer seen as passive pawns in a political game. They are active, educated, and often professionally accomplished women who have chosen to enter the royal family and who are expected to forge their own modern role within it. The gilded cage has not disappeared entirely, but its doors have been opened. The long and often tragic history of marriage as a dynastic sacrifice has, for the most part, come to an end, replaced by a new and more human ideal of partnership, of companionship, and of love.
Reflection on Daughters of Europe. As the final, quiet moments of our journey come to a close, and as the soft, velvet darkness of the night prepares to welcome you into the world of sleep, let us pause for a final reflection on the lives of these royal daughters of Europe. Theirs is a story that is at once distant and familiar, a story of immense fairy tale privilege and of a profound and often heartbreaking human suffering. It is a story that speaks to us across the centuries, a quiet, haunting, and deeply moving meditation on the themes of beauty, of sorrow, and of the enduring strength of the human spirit. The first and most powerful impression is one of a profound and almost tragic irony. These women were born at the very apex of the social pyramid. They were surrounded, from birth, by a level of wealth, of luxury, and of power that was almost divine. And yet, in the one area of life that we now consider to be the most fundamental of human rights, the right to choose one's own path, to love whomever one chooses, to be the author of one's own life, they were utterly and completely powerless. Their lives were a paradox, a story of immense external wealth and of a deep internal poverty of the spirit. They were the queens of a gilded cage, and their story is a poignant reminder that true freedom is not a matter of crowns or of palaces or of jewels. Their story is also a quiet and powerful testament to the theme of endurance. We have seen the immense pressures that were placed upon them, the crushing weight of dynastic duty, the loneliness of a foreign court, the constant anxious burden of producing an heir, the physical and emotional pain of a life of constant pregnancy and of frequent heartbreaking loss.
Many of them were broken by this pressure, but many more were not. They endured. They found ways to create a life of meaning and of purpose within the narrow, prescribed boundaries of their role. They became patrons of the arts. They devoted themselves to charity. They found solace in their faith. They became shrewd and often powerful political players in their own right. Theirs is a story not of passive victimhood, but of a quiet, dignified, and often heroic resilience.
And finally, their story is a meditation on beauty and on sorrow. We see them in their portraits, the great masterpieces of Holbein, of Velázquez, of Winterhalter. They look out at us from across the centuries, their faces serene, their gowns a magnificent cascade of silk and of velvet, their jewels glittering in the soft painted light. They are images of an almost unearthly beauty, icons of a lost world of elegance and of grace. But now, when we look at these portraits, we can see them with new eyes. We can see the faint, almost imperceptible sadness in the eyes of a young princess who is about to be sent to a foreign land. We can see the weary resignation in the face of a queen who has buried too many of her own children. We can see the subtle, physical signs of the genetic fragility that was the secret, hidden burden of their supposedly pure blood. The story of the royal daughters of Europe is a story that is, in the end, both beautiful and deeply sad. It is a story of how the grand, impersonal forces of history, of politics, of religion, of genetics are played out in the small, fragile, and deeply human lives of individuals. It is a story that reminds us that behind every crown and behind every great name in a history book, there is a human heart with its own hopes, its own fears, and its own quiet and often untold story of suffering and of endurance.